soul.
Morning, NAC. Before we get started, there's something I want to make you aware of and entice you to come to. On November 20th, which is a Sunday, we are going to, among other things, have kids that have been off at college back in town, and so we wanted to do a family game night that's going to be here at the church. That's going to start at 4 p.m. We plan on starting with like some volleyball and outdoor games. We're going to have some pizza and that kind of thing, and then we'll be able to move indoors for some other games and that kind of thing. We'll be getting in touch with you and reminding you several times this week to let you know, but go ahead and make plans for that. Again, that'll be Sunday, November 20th at 4 p.m. So, and look for more information coming out this week. So we had that election that we were talking about, and it again serves to remind me of how sort of contentious things have become and how it bleeds into other things. Part of it is because we had that election. Part of it is because Thanksgiving is coming up. Oh yeah, I'm supposed to dismiss the children. You don't have to listen to me. Move along. Except for that move along part. There's a running joke about people's families getting together for Thanksgiving, and they sit around the table, and then some contentious issue comes up, and Thanksgiving becomes about this back and forth. I did hear somebody one time suggest that the quickest way to stop that kind of thing around the Thanksgiving table is to simply say, what is the policy on that? And that everybody just changes the subject because nobody knows, because they're mostly just quoting talking points from whatever their news source is. But I want to talk about something even deeper than just like a party trick to get out of that, although you can use that if you want to. It seems to me that we, and I'll go ahead and put that we in all caps because I'm definitely included in it, we get into this mode, and there's a lot of things pulling us into this mode right now, to where we start to think, and maybe think is even too strong a word, we start to feel like what's most important is that we are right and that everybody else admits that we're right. That we are technically correct and that everybody admits that we're correct. And really, it starts to feel like that second part becomes even more important. Like other people admitting that they're wrong and we're right. And it's a terrible mode to be in for a human being. It's a really terrible mode to be in as a human being who's trying to follow Jesus, because, curiously, as the one who actually is right, he doesn't appear to operate that way. So today I want to talk about what I think the Bible puts forward as a better goal than being right. Because I'm going to suggest that when just being right, and certainly in the contentious way to where it involves proving everybody else wrong and maintaining our own status of being right and getting them to admit it, that twists into something else. It twists into something dark and ugly, no matter how technically correct our information or ideas are. So turn, if you will, to Luke chapter 11, verse 42. Luke chapter 11, verse 42, and these are the words of Jesus. He says, "Woe to you, Pharisees, because you give God a tenth of your mint and rue and all other kinds of garden herbs, but you neglect justice and the love of God. You should have practiced the latter without leaving the former undone." So Jesus is talking to the Pharisees, and you know, because he addresses them directly, which is helpful. And he says, "Woe to you. Hey, you guys are in trouble. Hey, there's something going on here that if you really understood it would bring you great sort of despair and sorrow if you realized what you were doing." Why? Because, and here it gets weirdly specific, because you give God a tenth of your mint and rue and all other kinds of garden herbs. So, obviously a nod to tithing, but you have this group of Pharisees who are taking it to the level of not just their money, but they're going into their kitchens. Now spices have a little bit more value in their culture because they couldn't just run down to Walmart and go to that spice rack by McCormick and pull what they want for like $2.50. They're harder to come up with. But still, they're going in and they're going into their kitchen, their supplies, and they're even taking their valuable herbs and spices, and I don't know why I went Kentucky Fried Chicken. They're going in and they're taking their herbs and they're taking their different spices and they're taking a tenth of that and giving it to God too. And Jesus says, hey guys, woe to you. Because you're being that meticulous, but you neglect justice and the love of God. You're very meticulous with all this rule keeping. You're taking it and applying it to things that other people wouldn't even think to apply it to. You're getting so caught up in meticulous adherence to the law, but you're doing it to the exclusion of things like justice. And for whatever reason in our culture, we have a very narrow view of justice, which is only a part of what it means, certainly in their culture. We think of justice as sort of wrong being punished, and that is an aspect of it. But justice, and you can look this up, you don't have to take my word for it, justice, their concept of justice has to do with things being set right. It's why on our courthouses we have the picture of the lady holding the scales. The scales is a symbol for justice because it has to do with balance. It has to do with the things that were wrong being made right, and the things that are wrong not being allowed to succeed. It has to do with lifting up even the downtrodden. That's a matter of biblical justice. It's about good coming through. It's about evil not winning the day. It's about things being set right. Now, what Jesus doesn't say is, so forget all of that giving stuff and do this other stuff instead. He does seem to take a dig at sort of the weird meticulousness of it, but he says, okay, but you should have practiced, you should have done the good that you were doing without leaving the more important good undone. It's not an either or. You don't get to get extra credit by taking the law farther so that you don't have to care about mercy and love. You don't get to extra follow the rules so that you don't have to be kind. You don't get to be extra meticulous over here to build up credit so that you can be un-Christ-like in the way that you deal with people, so that you can not care about the way that you engage with the world in the name of Jesus. And it occurred to me as I was looking at this lesson this week, I was back and forth on whether I was even going to mention this word because it's such a churchy kind of word, but there's a legalistic way of approaching Bible and religion and everything else, and the more that I thought about that, the more that I realized that kind of meticulous legalism, which usually has to do with very particular application of a person's interpretation of the rules, binding it on other people, really pointing out to other people how they're not getting it right, like you, that kind of legalistic approach to religion is still incredibly self-focused and individualistic. It's still about making sure that you're covered. Taking care of your own salvation and your own status, which seems really odd for people who are following Jesus, who gave himself away for the sake of others. We'll come back to that idea some more because Jesus talks about it some more. But I want to talk about this passage just a little bit more, where he gets so meticulous about the mint and the rue, and you wonder, okay, well, what brought that on? Hearing Jesus say, woe to you, to this group of people, and bringing up this weird, meticulous kind of thing and getting on to him about it, what was the context for that? By the way, if you want to follow along with the notes in YouVersion, I did that this week, so it's there. Pick up in Luke chapter 11 and back up to verse 37. This is going to be the context for the scene that we just saw. When Jesus had finished speaking, a Pharisee invited him to eat with him, so he went in and reclined at the table. But the Pharisee was surprised when he noticed that Jesus did not first wash before the meal. Then the Lord said to him, "Now then, you Pharisee, clean the outside of the cup and the dish. You clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside you are full of greed and wickedness. You foolish people. Did not the one who made the outside make the inside also? But now as for what is inside you, be generous to the poor, and everything will be clean for you." So Jesus had been out speaking. A Pharisee comes up to him and invites him to his house for dinner. The Pharisee sees Jesus go in and recline at the table. Their tables were low to the ground. They didn't really use chairs. They kind of reclined on beside the table. And it noticed that Jesus doesn't wash his hands. Now, the thing you should know is that doesn't have to do with hygiene per se, at least not on the face of it. They didn't even understand about bacteria and germs and that kind of thing before they eat. It's a ceremonial thing. He didn't go through the ceremonial washing that observant Jews did. He just goes in and reclines at the table. Note, he doesn't really say anything about it. Like the Pharisee doesn't say anything about it, he just thinks about it. Then the Lord said to him, "Hey, you Pharisees, you clean the outside of the dish, but you don't do anything about the inside. Didn't the same person make the inside and the outside? If you wash the whole thing, then the whole thing will be clean." I used to, when I was a youth minister, I used to do this devotional, and it was great when you did it at summer camp because the kids have been hot. They've been outside all day. Just brilliant. So I would go in and I'd bring this little cooler, and they would all be sitting around in the circle on the benches in the sun or wherever we were. And then I would pull out this pitcher of ice water. I mean, condensation on the side, dripping down. Oh, it worked like a charm every time. I sat down on a little table. I was like, "I need a volunteer. Who's thirsty?" And it's usually a teenage boy that volunteers first. Not always, but usually. A little bit gratifying when it is. "All right, you, come on up front." I say, "All I want you to do is drink some of this ice water." And they're like, "Yeah." Because they don't think 2 or 3 steps ahead. I say, "Oh, well, you can't drink it right out of the pitcher. Let me get you a glass." And what they don't know is earlier that morning, I'd gone into whatever cafeteria was there, and I'd gone into whatever pantry is there, whatever, and I would take whatever I could find, ketchup, mustard, relish, banana pudding, whatever, and I would just smear it all together inside the thing, and then I would really wipe down the ice outside the glass. And then I would pull out the glass, I would hand it to the kid, and I would start to pour it, and they would always reach out and stop me. I'd be like, "What? You said you would drink the water." And they'd be like, "But it's gross on the outside. It's dirty." I was like, "I cleaned it myself." And I would drag this out just an amazing amount of time. Until finally they're like, "But it's not clean because it's not clean on the inside." And then I would pull out another glass that I had cleaned and pour the water, and they drink it. Because the point makes itself. Nobody would look at a glass that somebody only cleaned the outside of and call that clean. Or if you would, "I don't want to eat at your house." Nobody does. That's not how clean works. But, you're not telling me? But you kind of did. That's not how clean works. And you know that's not how clean works. But even in their culture, because Jesus is addressing it, but I'll argue maybe even more so in ours as we become more and more image obsessed with our photo filters and our curated content on our social media. Man, we sure do like cleaning up the outside, putting it on display. But it's so easy to get so focused on what we present to the world on the outside and what it looks like, that we neglect the truly important things. We neglect to work on our heart. We neglect to allow God to reshape our heart because we're so focused on what everything looks like. The Pharisees are surprised that Jesus doesn't follow their ceremonial customs. He says, you guys clean the outside, but inside you're full of greed and wickedness, so that's not actually clean. Then he says, if you clean the inside, the outside will be cleaned also. He posits this thing that says, okay, look, if you clean the outside of a thing, it's very, very possible to clean the outside of a thing without cleaning the inside of it. But to really clean the inside, we're going to have to dunk it under and rinse it. It's really not possible to clean the inside without cleaning the outside. If you clean the inside, then the outside's going to be clean too. But then he drops this, and in all the sermons and lessons I've ever heard on this, I don't remember anybody really touching this. I don't know why, because it is the next thing he says, and it's definitely connected. He says, verse 41, but now as for what is inside you, be generous to the poor, and everything will be clean for you. Now, part of that has to do, I think, with what he already said they were full of. He said, you are full of greed and wickedness. You see that? You're full of greed and wickedness. Clean the inside and the outside will be clean too. Hey, you know what will go a long way in cleaning up your heart? If you dropped all that and decided to be generous to the poor. If you quit trying to find the justification for not doing and being what God told you to do and be, and just did it, instead of telling me how many of your kitchen spices you're separating out and tithing. Instead of telling me the special thing you do between prayers on Sunday that nobody else gets right, that makes you really, really right with God. Instead of focusing on all the ways that you think you're right, there's a way of doing that, of trying to debate and argue that you have the correct answers without ever actually letting your heart become good. Without ever letting God do the thing that He wanted to do in you that was the point to start with. Not a God looking to be appeased, a God who is looking to reconcile the world to Himself. A God who calls us and conscripts us into what He's doing in the world because we were made to bear His image, to participate in what He's doing. A God who has a church of Christ, to be sure, but for the sake of the world. And the kind of legalistic, meticulous way of practicing religion that stays concerned with maintaining our own salvation rather than the thing that God actually called us to in the first place misses the point entirely and can make you a less Christ-like person. There's a way of practicing religion that makes you more selfish. There's a way of practicing religion. Here's an interesting thing. The word that composes the root words that compose the word religion are the word re, which you're familiar with because we use it all over the place. It means again. And then there's ligio, which is the same word that we get ligament from. And there's kind of two ways of understanding it. It could mean to bind again. Binding someone again to rules and restricting them. And there's certainly ways of practicing religion, Christianity and others, that is incredibly descriptive of. But the original intent of the word, and the one that I like the most, religio, is reconnection. From the God who gives us the ministry of reconciliation, who saw in the beginning there was this perfect harmony between God and people, people and other people, people and God's creation. And it's that harmony that's shattered, and it's that harmony that God's bringing back together. But the legalistic approach of trying to meticulously follow rules to write your ledger, that winds up being the binding again religion. Whereas following the way of Jesus, allowing God to mold our heart, clothe us with Christ, and then shape us into the image of Christ, following Jesus in what He would have us do and be in the world is actually more of that reconnection between reconnecting God and people, people and people, people and God's creation. One of those is deeply flawed and unhealthy, and one of them is healthy and good. Be generous to the poor, and everything will be clean for you? Are there other things that you should be doing? Sure, there's lots of other Bible. There's other things that it tells you to do. But again, in a phrase that you've heard me say before, and I'm going to say again, it may be more than that, but it isn't less than that. There is no not generous to the poor Christianity as far as Jesus is concerned. On another occasion, talking to the Pharisees, Jesus says, and this is in Mark 7, starting verse 9, and there's not a slide for this. He says, then he said, you skillfully sidestep God's law in order to hold on to your own tradition. For instance, Moses gave you this law from God, honor your father and mother, and anyone who speaks disrespectfully of their father and mother must be put to death. But I tell you, but you say that it's all right for people to say to their parents, sorry, I can't help you, for I have vowed to give to God what I would have given to you. In this way, you let them disregard their needy parents. And so you cancel the word of God in order to hand down your own tradition, and this is only one example among many others. Then Jesus called the crowd to come and hear. All of you listen, he said, and try to understand. It's not what goes into your body that defiles you. You are defiled by what comes from your heart. So there's this weird gatekeeping that people try to do where they start to say, okay, I'm not even going to come in contact. I'm not going to come close. I'm not going to let anything that comes into me corrupt me. And so you're going to have certain convictions about things. You should follow those. You should follow your conscience. I'm not saying that. But he's saying that's not really how you measure being defiled. It's not the marker of it. What comes out of your heart is the sign of whether or not something's defiled or not. It's not the way you're taking portions of even your kitchen spices to give to God in the tithe that makes you right with God. What's coming out of your heart is a sign of whether or not that's going in the right direction, that's pure, that's godly or not. And it's a different metaphor, but it makes sense even with what you know from the fruit of the Spirit, where it says, okay, you want to know what fruit the Spirit bears if it's present. You want to know the sign that the Spirit is going in those directions. Well, here are the things that you'll see there. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Is it bearing that fruit? Then that's the way the wind of the Spirit is blowing. Is it not? Then no matter how churchy it sounds or looks, it's not. No matter how well you can argue it, no matter how good you are at not listening and beating somebody down about it, no matter how many proof texts you've found, if it isn't leading in the direction of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, that ain't the way the Spirit's going. It's just that simple. Pick up in Colossians chapter 2, starting verse 20. Paul's talking to the Colossian church, and he says, since you died with Christ to the elemental spiritual forces of this world, why, as though you still belong to the world, do you submit to its rules? Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. These rules, which have to do with things that are destined to perish with use, are based on merely human commands and teachings. Such regulations indeed have the appearance of wisdom, with their self-imposed worship, their false humility, and their harsh treatment of the body, but they lack any value in restraining sensual indulgence. So to the Colossian church, and I really like how Paul writes sometimes. He's a lawyer. I like the way he sets stuff up. So he says, since you guys died to the world's way of doing things, to the spiritual elemental forces, why do you still live as if you belonged to the world? Why are you still trying to follow the world's rules? And he's going to give you some examples of the world's rules. Now, I don't know what you expect to come next, but here's what he lists. Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. Now, I think most people looking at that would say, that sounds like the church's rules. Paul, who wrote most of your New Testament, doesn't think so. Paul thinks those are the world's rules. He says, these rules, which have to do with things that are destined to perish with use, are based on merely human commands and teachings. He says, such regulations indeed have an appearance of wisdom. They seem wise. With their self-imposed worship, their false humility, and their harsh treatment of the body, but here it comes. But they lack any value in restraining sensual indulgence. What people want at the end of the day, what people think they want at the end of the day, isn't so much salvation. Where God comes in and makes us right because He wants to, where God by grace, thereby leveling the playing field, saves us, rescues us because He wants to. What we want is a really good sin management system. And we really like it if there were points where we could outscore somebody else. We want our paltry merits to count for something. We want to be able to talk about how we've paid our dues. But that doesn't work or make any sense in the context of grace. It's not the deal. The reason such rules are ineffective, the reason why they're the world's rules, is they still have to do with you pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, with you white-knuckling it, with you by your own willpower being better than everybody else and making yourself what you can't make yourself, because that's why we need grace. You're saying we shouldn't try? No. You love Jesus, you should try for Him. You try for the people you love. But God said the whole time that He shapes us, He molds us, that it's Him that brings about the transformation. We want these rules to use like tools that we can, self-improvement tools. But you know as well as I do, if we're really being honest, that those rules may work for a little while, but then they stop working. Psychology and sociology are telling us over and over and over again something the Bible has been hinting at the whole time. Willpower itself is an exhaustible commodity. You run out of it. That's why all the self-help programs and everything else tell you, you can't do this by yourself. They hook you up with other people. They hook you up into a higher power because you can't do this by yourself. It's not something that you can just handle. You can't. It's not something that you can just manage. You can't. It's grace and salvation. Not a pamphlet on how to climb out of the well you fell in. It's rescue. A nice list of rules never saved anybody. A nice list of rules never pulled anybody out of addiction or sin. They lack any value in restraining sensual indulgence. They can't do it. They can't carry the luggage. They're not enough. What we need is something else. Now, if you were to continue in Colossians, we're not, but I recommend that you do it sometime. If you were to continue in Colossians, you would find out that he says, okay, the alternative is dying to the person you were, embracing your new life in Christ, letting God clothe you with Christ, and then allowing God to reshape and remake you. That, he says, would work, but it's a completely different way of approaching it. And it has to do with you letting go of control. I think I've told this story before, but it's not a long story, so I'll tell it again. When I lived in Panama City and I was a youth minister, we used to take people to this event down in Orlando every year called Rock the Universe. Disney does something similar. There's called Night of Joy. This was at Universal Studios. It's called Rock the Universe, and they would bring in Christian bands, and you would go and you'd spend the day in the park, and then about 5, 6 o'clock, they'd kick everybody, not with the event, out. And you got to stay there till all night basically, and there are stages and concerts, and they keep the rides open. It was a lot of fun. So I go this one year. We go, and one of the chaperones we got was a guy named O.J. Sanchez. O.J. Sanchez was a test pilot for the Air Force. The F-15 Raptor, he was one of the first people that flew that. And so the first thing that we do when we go into Islands of Adventure, and it was always the first thing we did, partially because of the placement, partially because of how good a ride it was, is we went to get on the Incredible Hulk ride. Now, the Incredible Hulk ride is one of the first ones that I ever saw that does this. You get on it, and you know how most roller coasters, you go click, 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 and you start? They took a different approach. This is more like being shot out of a gun. I mean, you're looking at them, you see the people kind of strapping in, and then it's gone. And so we're in line, the line doesn't move incredibly fast, and so we're sitting there watching it, and we're starting to see where we can see people disappearing. And I look back, and O.J. Sanchez is visibly nervous. Like the man is sweating bullets, he's like looking around, and I can tell he's not going to do it because he's chaperone, but he's thinking about how does he get out of there. And I'm like, dude, you're a test pilot. What are you doing? Why does this scare you? And he goes, I said, you flew the Raptor. What are you doing? He goes, yeah, but in those jets, I've got the stick. That's us. We like it when we got the stick. We like it when we got the wheel. The idea of actually turning ourselves over and letting God be in control terrifies us if we're being honest. We have trouble with the trust part of faith. And so we want a good management system, but that's not what's on offer. What's on offer is grace. What's on offer is salvation and redemption. What's on offer is a God who will clothe you with Christ because you're not there yet, and then spend the rest of your relationship shaping you into the image of Christ as you remain open to Him doing that. Last passage, Galatians chapter 5, starting in verse 1. The Galatian church, Paul says, "It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. Mark my words. I, Paul, tell you that if you let yourselves be circumcised, Christ will be of no value to you at all. Again, I declare to every man who lets himself be circumcised that he is obligated to obey the whole law. You who are trying to be justified by the law have been alienated from Christ. You have fallen away from grace. For through the Spirit we eagerly await by faith the righteousness for which we hope. For in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision has any value. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love." So Paul's writing to the Galatian church. The Galatian church has an interesting thing. They have had some people come in who are basically preaching a very legalistic gospel. There's some debate and discussion at the time about you have these Jews who have become Christians, and they are importing their Jewish traditions, including circumcision as a sign of the covenant. And so they're making it a part of Gentiles converting to Christianity that the males must also be circumcised, which probably hurts your outreach efforts a little bit, but that's what they're pitching, and there are people going along with it. And Paul comes in and says, look, anything plus Jesus is heresy. Like, if you're adding anything to Jesus, if you're adding anything to His gospel, it's heresy. If you're saying this, but then also this and this and this and this, I challenge you sometime to look at every time Paul actually talks about false teachers, you'll be a little bit surprised. Because his descriptions of them are not people who are just saying, hey, everybody, run wild. It's fine. Also not a good idea, but that's not what they say. Paul gets onto people and calls them false teachers way more often than not because they are adding things on, because they're being more restrictive, because they're giving them extra dietary rules, they're giving them extra rituals that they're requiring, because they're binding their own convictions on other people. And Paul says, no, Jesus is enough. Anything else, anything more, making that required, as sort of a legalistic requirement of salvation, is heresy, is false teaching. So to this church, he says, it's for freedom that Christ has set you free, which is a redundant statement, but one that they need to hear. He says, stand firm. Stand firm on what? That you were set free for freedom. Don't be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. Then he does the whole thing about circumcision and uncircumcision, and frankly, you could substitute other legalistic things in there because the same principle applies. Then there's this line. Verse 4. You who are trying to be justified by the law have been alienated from Christ. You have fallen away from grace. Okay, if you have a condition by which in the Bible people have been alienated from Christ, you might want to pay attention to what that condition is, correct? It doesn't come up a lot. What is it here? You who are trying to justify yourself by the law, you have been alienated from Christ. And here, and let me tell you, you can look, you can check my work on this. The only use in the entire Bible of the phrase fall from grace. The phrase originates here. This is its only meaning. People use it in a lot of different ways, but this is what it talks about biblically, and it's the only time it talks about it. Who falls from grace? Those who are trying to justify themselves by the law. Those who are acting like they don't need it. Those who are trying to embrace another good sin management system instead of the actual grace of God. You have fallen away from grace. That is the biblical definition. And then it drops this line again, which I don't think I've heard people talk about as much as the sentence merits, but I think probably, if I'm being fair to people, part of the reason they don't talk about it as much is because of where they put the little verse number, because it includes half a sentence about circumcision and it just doesn't make for a good memory verse. But verse 6, we'll go about halfway through it. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. And in Greek, the word translated only there means only. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. And you say, but I do this. Okay, is that faith expressing itself through love? If it is, then great. If it's not, then so what? The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. It's not a new concept. When the Pharisee tested Jesus in Matthew 23, asking what the greatest command in the law is, Jesus gives him two, even though he asked for one. But here's what it is. Love God with everything that you got. Love your neighbor as yourself. Who's my neighbor, Jesus? The people that aren't you. That's Jesus' definition of neighbor, by the way. The people that aren't you. You can rule out exactly one person from being your neighbor. Love God with everything that you got. Love your neighbor as yourself. Then he drops this. It says, all the law and the prophets hang on these two, meaning you could meticulously follow every single rule and law that you find in the entire Bible, and if you miss loving God with everything that you've got and loving your neighbor as yourself, you've missed all of it. But if you love God with everything that you've got and you love your neighbor as yourself, everything else hangs on that. See, you can just wash the outside of the dish and it still not be clean. Or you can wash the inside of the dish and the outside will be clean as well. When our goal is being right, when our goal is winning the argument, it can make us mean and hateful and unchristlike and, well, frankly, wrong, no matter how technically correct our ideas or actions may or may not be. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself in love. You know what's a better goal than being correct? Being faithful, being loving, being true. You feel the difference between right and true, right? You feel the difference between being correct and being true. You know what's a better goal than being right? Being good. Because it's possible to craft a really technical, tight, precise, logical argument that nobody can fight back against and still be not good. And if that's the case, you are still being unchristlike and wrong and not on board with the gospel. But I don't think it's possible to pursue loving God with everything that we've got, to pursue truth, to pursue goodness, and not end up being right. It just doesn't seem as important anymore. It's set in its proper perspective, its right place. Love God with everything that you got. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself in love. But as for you, be generous to the poor, and everything will be clean for you. So try this. Practical application. This week, I want you to pray for God to provide you an opportunity to help someone less fortunate than yourself. I will be not more specific than that. I don't even think you should be more specific than that. Pray every day that God would provide an opportunity for you to help someone less fortunate than yourself. And then when God, who wants that more than you do, shows you that opportunity, makes you aware of that opportunity, nudges you toward that opportunity, take action and help that person by the end of the day on Saturday. End of activity. Pray for God to show you an opportunity to help someone less fortunate than yourself. Then step 2, help that person. Try to do it by the end of the day Saturday. It wouldn't be a terrible thing to do beyond this week, but try it out for this week to start with. See how it goes. May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in Him, so that you may overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. And the church said together, amen.